Hello and greetings everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate the time you take to watch my videos. This video will continue the series about Pantheism in Asatru. The last time we spoke about the history of the Germanic people and how Pantheism was passed on to them. This time we will look for the Eddas, but we are not still at the final conclusion of this whole thing. But before we can discuss the pantheism shown in the Edda, we have to keep in mind and have an understanding what the Eddas are, how they were written, and by whom they were written. Of course, you all know Snorri Sturluson wrote the Eddas, of course, but did he write every single poem inside them? No, he didn't. He collected material, oral and written, and put it into the Eddas. He was sort of the one compiling things together into one big work. But most of the stuff that is written in the Edda was not written by Snorri Sturluson, but really dates back, far later in time. Actually, the earliest texts we have inside the Edda that date back to roughly 400 AD. So it is really a summary of quite some things that happened and were written earlier. Now, when we look at the Edda, it's important to keep in mind that those texts were, I think, without exception written by Skalds. So we have to know what Skalds are. What did they do? Skalds made a living by telling tales, by educating people and getting paid for entertaining people. And that's the important thing. The Old Norse people loved riddles, and they loved to be educated. They didn't want to hear stories about heroic stuff if they couldn't learn something from them. For them it was very important that stories had educational value, that you could learn something by solving the riddles presented. So Skalds would very often write texts multi-layered, with multi-layered meanings. They may write a text that has a meaning word by word, so you can follow the story, but each word inside the story has a meaning in itself, and each word basically builds up to a sentence that has a much deeper meaning than you would normally tell in the conversation. One example is the hand of the helm bearer snows richly wherever there is a source of fluid. What does this mean? Well, the helm bearer is the king. So the king is very generous because his hand snows. He snows richly. And wherever there is a source of fluid, that would be our short Scaldic term of describing the king loves to give great tips whenever he gets dead drunk in a tavern. That's Scaldic poetry for the king got dead drunk and everyone serving was happy because they got a lot of money. And that's one thing, to express something poetically. But they also loved to teach with their texts. And that is very important to keep in mind. Skalds weren't just entertainers, they were initiates into mystics and into science in medieval standards. That means that Skalds spent a hell lot of time getting educated, getting familiar with the mythology, with the religion, with the philosophy, and with the knowledge of the time, because they were teachers. And they tried to teach people. A good example is that they tried to teach history. So they may have used the gods to teach actual history that really happened. A good example is the Aesir-Vanir War. We don't know if the gods really fought each other. I mean, the gods Aesir versus Vanir, we don't know if that really happened. But we do know that something similar happened with mortals. We know that when the ancient Germanic tribes emigrated from Asia and immigrated into Europe, they were warriors. They were very warlike warmongers who wanted to conquer land. And when the Germanic tribes came from Asia, they met the peaceful, culturally quite advanced are beautiful people of Europe, the native Scandinavians, the megalith cultures of let's say Stone Age Scandinavia. What was the difference between those? Well, the people in Europe, as far as we know, were incestuous. They viewed it as perfectly normal to marry one's brother or sister. And that's exactly what the Vanir in the Pantheon do. They are okay with that. Freya and Freyr are married, even though they are siblings. Now, the Aesir didn't do that, and we know that the Germanic people didn't do that. They loved to marry between families rather into their own families to create alliances. So we can be sure that this trait actually is also true for the real people, for the historical people, and not only for the gods. We know that when the Germanic people invaded, they attacked the native population of Europe and conquered them. They waged war, just like the Aesir did in the story. We know that after some time of war, that the Germanic people gave up and said, okay, you know what, let's make peace, let's settle, we will exchange hostages, like the Germanic people always did in such times to ensure peace, and marry each other, so as it was their tradition, so that we become one family, we become one people. And thus the Germanic people and the native European people intermarried and became one people. And that is true for the gods as well. The Aesir and the Vanir did exactly that. They exchanged hostages and they intermarried and became one people, one big family of gods. So we have no idea if this story in the Edda actually refers to a real historic event, or if it's a story about the gods, or if both are true. And we will see that quite often the Skalds use the gods to express various ideas, to get things over to uneducated people, to use the gods that everyone is familiar with, or to say it more modern, terminology that everyone knows and is familiar with, to express ideas that people are not familiar with. So explain it in their own language, so to speak. They did this quite often, like the story of Beowulf has some elements that are clearly fantasy, that are just there for entertainment. But we know that Beowulf really lived. It was a real historical person. Every people that were present in the story of Beowulf in the Edda are actually real historical people that really lived and really had their issues, and it basically, the story Beowulf in the Edda is a historical saga. They base on real truth, and we know that the Old Norse people told history like that. They would stay close to reality and add some cool stuff to make it more entertaining, but they stay true to the actual history. That's how they passed it on. And the Edda did exactly the same. But not only with history, they only passed on knowledge of science. To give you an example, we know that the Old Norse people knew that electricity existed and how it was conducted. Now that may sound strange, but really all you need to create a bolt of lightning is amber and fir, and both were abundant in Scandinavia. I mean, fir, you basically lived from hunting, so fur was omnipresent. Your clothing was made of fur. Basically most stuff you used to warm yourself was made of fur, and amber lay around everywhere. And so all you need to conduct electricity is amber and fur, and Zuf made a hammer of Thor hit you. I'm pretty sure it was some childhood joke of some people to rub fur against amber and then electrocute people with it. We know that they knew that electricity existed and how it worked, and they expressed it in a saga about Thor. It's very interesting because in this saga, Thor uses things that he doesn't use so often in other sagas. We have his gauntlets, which represent the positive and the negative pole. We have his belt, which is the actual conductor through which the electricity runs. we have Mjolnir, his hammer, which actually stands for the power of the electricity that hits and smashes you, the ampere if you will. And we have Thor, who basically builds up to the electrical discharge by throwing the hammer. So the volt, I don't know the exact terms in English, that makes this a bit difficult to do. But the thing is, this story of Thor throwing his hammer that can only be held by him if he wears his gauntlets of power, and only if he wears his belt of strength. Only then can Thor direct and guide his hammer Mjolnir to crush things. And we all know that his hammer Mjolnir is thought to be responsible for lightning. When Thor throws lightning, he basically throws his hammer and baff, the impact is what his hammer does. And the story about Thor with his gauntlets and everything, that is a perfect metaphor of how electricity works. And that could have been a way of using the god Thor that everyone was familiar with to explain how electricity works to people who have no idea about what the hell is electricity. How does it work? This story explains it as a metaphor. And that's something that most scientists forget when they look at religion, that religions are usually rich with metaphors for things. They aren't meant by the word. They don't mean that lightning is a hammer. I mean, everyone who saw lightning knows that there is no hammer, that it has no hammer form, that it isn't a hammer, but it is a metaphor. And that's a metaphor. And that is really, really a thing you should keep in mind when reading such things. And we know that other things of scientific value were passed on by stories, like how do I get infected? That's also those tiny little spirits of nature, some of whom are, well, let's say evil, or if they don't like you, you can inhale them. That's why there were such superstitions like you shouldn't sneeze at someone or cough at someone, because that means that you are helping those tiny little spirits of nature, those trolls, to harm another person. That's why they said if someone is sneezing or coughing, to keep your bodily opening shut so that the trolls can't enter. That's why they had superstitions like you have to close your windows and doors when you are giving birth so that the baby is protected from those trolls that lurk outside and may make it sick and such. That is actually good advice. It's also the reason why people washed so regularly. We know that the Vikings would wash daily and brush their hair and everything. And it was based on superstition that if you don't do that, the trolls will be there and make all kinds of evil things to you. And while that sounds stupid from a scientific view, it actually has the same sense. It uses scientific methods of cleaning yourself to protect you from illness and to protect outbreaks. Superstition. Ill people who are affected by trolls should hide away from society so that the trolls don't do harm to other people. And that's a quarantine. It's logic. You should do that, but you can't tell people, if you're sick, stay where you are. The hell, why? I still have to do this and that. No, superstition comes into play to keep those people in check, and that's where superstition becomes very useful. It's just like the fear of God's revenge or godly punishment, like we have in Christianity, is basically helping as a imaginary police force. If you think that God is watching over you all the time and sees everything you do, and everything you do will have consequences, you basically don't need as a big police force. If people really believe in that God and that punishment, they will try to behave according to the law, even if there is no policeman around who would watch over them or could arrest them. And in times when police was really rare, that was very important. So it serves a purpose. Back to Asatru. The Skalds also did teach philosophies and, of course, religion by such stories. They were very well-learned people of their culture, very educated, and they, as said, got paid for telling stories that educate people. Now, having that in mind, the Eddas are works of educational value. They have stories that teach people about their religion, about their gods, but they also tell people and teach people about philosophy and about science, and of course are full of interesting stories. So those stories are multi-layered. It's very common that one story would have a very mundane meaning, that is just the story in itself, the fun of it. It would also have a historical meaning, because quite often those stories told are based on real historical events, so people would be educated about the past of their people. And they often had a philosophy or a religious or scientific knowledge that would show for those who really think about it, who think not in the story, but really think about what the story is about. And we see that very commonly in the Eddas. The problem is that in the Eddas that we have, the translations, the names are usually not translated, and that is the huge problem why I say it's so important to speak Old Norse if you read the Eddas, because words like Odin or Vili or Geir are not translated. The translators watched it and said, oh hey, that has to be a name because it is used like a name. But actually those are words, and those words describe beings, just like names describe people. You know, earlier in the day it was common to name people after attributes they had. They wouldn't be called Bjorn, because Bjorn to us means nothing, it's a name. Back then Bjorn meant the bear, because he had the physical features of a bear, or maybe mental features of a bear, and thus he was called the bear. Or another guy may have been called Bjarni. Now Barney, as we know it today, is just a name for us with no meaning, but actually it means the bright one, which usually referred to the color of his hair. So if someone was called Bjarni, he was blonde, usually, or very light brown hair. Now, those names meant something, and that's also true for the gods. All the gods' names can be translated to actual words. Let's take Odin as example. Odin is actually a modernization of the word Othin with DH, and DH is in Scandinavia a letter that looks similar to the Latin D, so it got confused, but actually it's Othin, and Othin is translatable by the spirit, the rage, the fury, the insight, the spirituality even. And thus the word Odin is a word, and you see that stands for something. The spirit has a whole different meaning than Odin. If in a story they talk about the spirit, they may talk about Odin as the god, as the entity, but they may also speak about the spirit and its various attributes. Okay, now we are finished with that little background, and let's get a bit deeper into things. What is also important to understand Scaldic poetry is that they often would address gods not by their names, as said right now. Names stand for something, so they wouldn't address Odin as the spirit, as Odin, because they may use the spirit to express something that has to do with the spirit and not with Odin as entity. If they refer to Odin as entity, as God, as being, they would describe his being. They would call him Greybeard, or One Eye, or the Wanderer, or the Seer, and such things. They would call him by attributes that describe the entity Odin, the Raven Lord or something. They would call him such things and not by his name, to differentiate between when they are actually speaking about the god Odin and the concept of spirit. which they couldn't differentiate by the name because Odin means the spirit, so they tried to differentiate it that way. I think that is the most important stuff to tell you about this. One more thing maybe. No, I think that's really it for this video. We will continue next time, where we actually will be examining where pantheism is mentioned in the Edda and how much pantheism is shown inside the Eddas. I wish you a good day, have fun, enjoy the weather, and see you next time. Thanks for watching.